Chapter 13, The Social. Chapter. And a black abolitionist magazine named Freedom's Journal had appeared. Of the Liberator's first 25 subscribers, most were black. Blacks had to struggle constantly with the unconscious racism of white abolitionists. They also had to insist on their own independent voice. Douglas wrote for the Liberator, but in 1847 started his own newspaper in Rochester, North Star, which led to a break with Garrison. In 1854, a conference of Negroes declared, "It is emphatically our battle. No one else can fight it for us. Our relations to the anti-slavery movement must be and are changed. Instead of depending upon it, we must lead it." Certain black women faced the triple hurdle of being abolitionists in a slave society, of being black among white reformers, and of being women in a reform movement dominated by men. When Sojourner Truth rose to speak in 1853 in New York City at the Fourth National Women's Rights Convention, it all came together. There was a hostile mob in the hall, shouting, jeering, threatening. She said, "I know that it feels a kind of hissing and tickling to see a colored woman get up and tell you about things and women's rights. We have all been thrown down so low that nobody thought we'd ever get up again. But we will come up again, and now I'm here. We'll have our rights. See if we don't. And you can't stop us from them. See if you can. You may hiss as much as you like, but it is coming. I am sitting among you to watch, and every once in a while I will come out and tell you what time of night it is." After Nat Turner's violent uprising and Virginia's bloody repression, the security system inside the South became tighter. Perhaps only an outsider could hope to launch a rebellion. It was such a person, a white man of ferocious courage and determination, John Brown, whose wild scheme it was to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and then set off a revolt of slaves throughout the South. Harriet Tubman, 5 feet tall, some of her teeth missing, a veteran of countless secret missions piloting blacks out of slavery, was involved with John Brown and his plans. But sickness prevented her from joining him. Frederick Douglass, too, had met with Brown. He argued against the plan from the standpoint of its chances of success, but he admired the ailing man of 60, tall, gaunt, white-haired. Douglass was right. The plan would not work. The local militia, joined by 100 Marines under the command of Robert E. Lee, surrounded the insurgents. Although his men were dead or captured, John Brown refused to surrender. He barricaded himself in a small brick building near the gate of the armory. The troops battered down a door. A Marine lieutenant moved in and struck Brown with his sword. Wounded, sick, he was interrogated. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his book John Brown, writes, "Picture the situation. An old and blood-bespattered man, half dead from the wounds inflicted but a few hours before. A man lying in the cold and dirt, without sleep for 55 nerve-wrecking hours, without food for nearly as long, with the dead bodies of his 2 sons almost before his eyes, the piled corpses of his 7 slain comrades near and afar, a wife and a bereaved family listening in vain, and a lost cause, the dream of a lifetime, lying dead in his heart." Lying there, interrogated by the governor of Virginia, Brown said, "You had better, all you people at the South, prepare yourselves for a settlement of this question. You may dispose of me very easily. I am nearly disposed of now. But this question is still to be settled. This Negro question, I mean. The end of that is not yet." Du Bois appraises Brown's action. If his foray was the work of a handful of fanatics, led by a lunatic, and repudiated by the slaves to a man, then the proper procedure would have been to ignore the incident, quietly punish the worst offenders, and either pardon the misguided leader or send him to an asylum, while insisting that the raid was too hopelessly and ridiculously small to accomplish anything. The state nevertheless spent $250,000 to punish the invaders, stationed from 1,000 to 3,000 soldiers in the vicinity, and threw the nation into turmoil. In John Brown's last written statement in prison, before he was hanged, he said, "I, John Brown, am quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Ralph Waldo Emerson, not an activist himself, said of the execution of John Brown, "He will make the gallows holy as the cross." Of the 22 men in John Brown's striking force, 5 were black. 2 of these were killed on the spot, 1 escaped, and 2 were hanged by the authorities. Before his execution, John Copeland wrote to his parents, "Remember that if I must die, I die in trying to liberate a few of my poor and oppressed people from my condition of servitude, which God in his holy writ has hurled his most bitter denunciations against. I am not terrified by the gallows. I imagine that I hear you, and all of you, mother, father, sisters, and brothers, say, 'No, there is not a cause for which we, with less sorrow, could see you die.' Believe me when I tell you that though shut up in prison and under sentence of death, I have spent many more happy hours here, and I would almost as lief die now as at any time, for I feel that I am prepared to meet my Maker." John Brown was executed by the state of Virginia with the approval of the national government. It was the national government which, while weakly enforcing the law ending the slave trade, sternly enforced the laws providing for the return of fugitives to slavery. It was the national government that, in Andrew Jackson's administration, collaborated with the South to keep abolitionist literature out of the mails in the southern states. It was the Supreme Court of the United States that declared in 1857 that the slave Dred Scott could not sue for his freedom because he was not a person, but property. Such a national government would never accept an end to slavery by rebellion. It would end slavery only under conditions controlled by whites, and only when required by the political and economic needs of the business elite of the North. It was Abraham Lincoln who combined perfectly the needs of business, the political ambition of the new Republican Party, and the rhetoric of humanitarianism. He would keep the abolition of slavery not at the top of his list of priorities, but close enough to the top so it could be pushed there temporarily by abolitionist pressures and by practical political advantage. Lincoln could skillfully blend the interests of the very rich and the interests of the black at a moment in history when these interests met. And he could link these two with a growing section of Americans, the white, up-and-coming, economically ambitious, politically active middle class. As Richard Hofstadter put it, thoroughly middle class in his ideas, he spoke for those millions of Americans who had begun their lives as hired workers, as farmhands, clerks, teachers, mechanics, flatboatmen, and rail splitters, and had passed into the ranks of landed farmers, prosperous grocers, lawyers, merchants, physicians, and politicians. Lincoln could argue with lucidity and passion against slavery on moral grounds, while acting cautiously in practical politics. He believed that the institution of slavery is founded on injustice and bad policy, but that the promulgation of abolition doctrines tends to increase rather than abate its evils. Put against this, Frederick Douglass's statement on struggle, or Garrison's, "Sir, slavery will not be overthrown without excitement, a most tremendous excitement." Lincoln read the Constitution strictly to mean that Congress, because of the 10th Amendment, reserving to the states powers not specifically given to the national government, could not constitutionally bar slavery in the states. When it was proposed to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, which did not have the rights of a state, but was directly under the jurisdiction of Congress, Lincoln said this would be constitutional, but it should not be done unless the people in the district wanted it. Since most there were white, this killed the idea. As Hofstadter said of Lincoln's statement, it breathes the fire of an uncompromising insistence on moderation. Lincoln refused to denounce the fugitive slave law publicly. He wrote to a friend, "I confess I hate to see the poor creatures hunted down, but I bite my lips and keep quiet." And when he did propose in 1849, as a congressman, a resolution to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, he accompanied this with a section requiring local authorities to arrest and return fugitive slaves coming into Washington. This led Wendell Phillips, the Boston abolitionist, to refer to him years later as that slave hound from Illinois. He opposed slavery, but could not see blacks as equals. So a constant theme in his approach was to free the slaves and to send them back to Africa. In his 1858 campaign in Illinois for the Senate against Stephen Douglas, Lincoln spoke differently depending on the views of his listeners, and also perhaps depending on how close it was to the election. Speaking in northern Illinois in July in Chicago, he said, "Let us discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and that race, and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal." 2 months later in Charleston in southern Illinois, Lincoln told his audience, "I will say then that I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." Applause. "That I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, not of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Behind the secession of the South from the Union, after Lincoln was elected president in the fall of 1860 as candidate of the new Republican Party, was a long series of policy clashes between North and South. The clash was not over slavery as a moral institution. Most Northerners did not care enough about slavery to make sacrifices for it, certainly not the sacrifice of war. It was not a clash of peoples. Most Northern whites were not economically favored, not politically powerful. Most Southern whites were poor farmers, not decision makers, but of elites. The Northern elite wanted economic expansion, free land, free labor, a free market, a high protective tariff for manufacturers, a Bank of the United States. The slave interests opposed all that. They saw Lincoln and the Republicans as making continuation of their pleasant and prosperous way of life impossible in the future. So, when Lincoln was elected, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union. Lincoln initiated hostilities by trying to repossess the federal base at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and 4 more states seceded. The Confederacy was formed. The Civil War was on. Lincoln's first inaugural address in March 1861 was conciliatory toward the South and the seceded states. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." And with the war 4 months on, when General John C. Fremont in Missouri declared martial law and said slaves of owners resisting the United States were to be freed, Lincoln countermanded this order. He was anxious to hold in the Union the slave states of Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware. It was only as the war grew more bitter, the casualties mounted, desperation to win heightened, and the criticism of the abolitionists threatened to unravel the tattered coalition behind Lincoln, that he began to act against slavery. Hofstadter puts it this way: "Like a delicate barometer, he recorded the trend of pressures, and as the radical pressure increased, he moved toward the left. Wendell Phillips said that if Lincoln was able to grow, it is because we have watered him." Racism in the North was as entrenched as slavery in the South, and it would take the war to shake both. New York blacks could not vote unless they owned $250 in property, a qualification not applied to whites. A proposal to abolish this, put on the ballot in 1860, was defeated 2-1, although Lincoln carried New York by 50,000 votes. Frederick Douglass commented, "The black baby of Negro suffrage was thought too ugly to exhibit on so grand an occasion. The Negro was stowed away like some people put out of sight their deformed children when company comes." Wendell Phillips, with all his criticism of Lincoln, recognized the possibilities in his election. Speaking at the Tremont Temple in Boston the day after the election, Phillips said, "If the Telegraph speaks truth, for the first time in our history, the slave has chosen a president of the United States. Not an abolitionist, hardly an anti-slavery man. Mr. Lincoln consents to represent an anti-slavery idea, a pawn on the political chessboard His value is in his position. With fair effort, we may soon change him for a knight, bishop, or queen, and sweep the board. Applause. Conservatives in the Boston upper classes wanted reconciliation with the South. At one point, they stormed an abolitionist meeting at the same Tremont Temple shortly after Lincoln's election and asked that concessions be made to the South in the interests of commerce, manufactures, agriculture. The spirit of Congress, even after the war began, was shown in a resolution it passed in the summer of 1861, with only a few dissenting votes. This war is not waged for any purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights of established institutions of those states, but to preserve the Union. The abolitionists stepped up their campaign. Emancipation petitions poured into Congress in 1861 and 1862. In May of that year, Wendell Phillips said, "Abraham Lincoln may not wish it. He cannot prevent it. The nation may not will it, but the nation cannot prevent it. I do not care what men want or wish. The Negro is the pebble in the cogwheel, and the machine cannot go on until you get him out." In July, Congress passed a Confiscation Act, which enabled the freeing of slaves of those fighting the Union. But this was not enforced by the Union's generals, and Lincoln ignored the non-enforcement. Garrison called Lincoln's policy stumbling, halting, prevaricating, irresolute, weak, besotted. And Phillips said Lincoln was a first-rate, second-rate man. An exchange of letters between Lincoln and Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, in August of 1862, gave Lincoln a chance to express his views. Greeley wrote, "Dear Sir, I do not intrude to tell you, for you must already know, that a great proportion of those who triumphed in your election are sorely disappointed and deeply pained by the policy you seem to be pursuing with regard to the slaves of rebels. We require of you, as the first servant of the Republic, charged especially and preeminently with this duty, that you execute the laws. We think you are strangely and disastrously remiss with regard to the emancipating provisions of the new Confiscation Act. We think you are unduly influenced by the counsels of certain politicians hailing from the border slave states." Greeley appealed to the practical need of winning the war. "We must have scouts, guides, spies, cooks, teamsters, diggers, and choppers from the blacks of the South, whether we allow them to fight for us or not. I entreat you to render a hearty and unequivocal obedience to the law of the land." Lincoln had already shown his attitude by his failure to countermand an order of one of his commanders, General Henry Halleck, who forbade fugitive Negroes to enter his army's lines. Now he replied to Greeley, "Dear Sir, I have not meant to leave anyone in doubt. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because it helps to save this Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would be help to save the Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Yours, A. Lincoln." So Lincoln distinguished between his personal wish and his official duty. When, in September 1862, Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, it was a military move, giving the South 4 months to stop rebelling, threatening to emancipate their slaves if they continued to fight, promising to leave slavery untouched in states that came over to the North. That on the first day of January A.D. 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Thus, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863, it declared slaves free in those areas still fighting against the Union, which it listed very carefully, and said nothing about slaves behind Union lines. As Hofstadter put it, the Emancipation Proclamation had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. The London Spectator wrote concisely, "The principle is not that a human being cannot justly own another, but that he cannot own him unless he is loyal to the United States." Limited as it was, the Emancipation Proclamation spurred anti-slavery forces. By the summer of 1864, 400,000 signatures asking legislation to end slavery had been gathered and sent to Congress, something unprecedented in the history of the country. That April, the Senate had adopted the 13th Amendment, declaring an end to slavery, and in January 1865, the House of Representatives followed. With the proclamation, the Union Army was open to blacks, and the more blacks entered the war, the more it appeared a war for their liberation. The more whites had to sacrifice, the more resentment there was, particularly among poor whites in the North, who were drafted by a law that allowed the rich to buy their way out of the draft for $300. And so the draft riots of 1863 took place, uprisings of angry whites in northern cities, their targets not the rich far away, but the blacks near at hand. It was an orgy of death and violence. A black man in Detroit described what he saw: a mob with kegs of beer on wagons, armed with clubs and bricks, marching through the city, attacking black men, women, children. He heard one man say, "If we are got to be killed up for Negroes, then we will kill everyone in this town." The Civil War was one of the bloodiest in human history up to that time. 600,000 dead on both sides in a population of 30 million. The equivalent in the United States of 1978, with a population of 250 million, of 5 million dead. As the battles became more intense, as the bodies piled up, as war fatigue grew, the existence of blacks in the South, 4 million of them, became more and more a hindrance to the South, and more an opportunity for the North. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction pointed this out. These slaves had enormous power in their hands. Simply by stopping work, they could threaten the Confederacy with starvation. By walking into the federal camps, they showed to doubting Northerners the easy possibility of using them thus, but by the same gesture, depriving their enemies of their use in just these fields. It was this plain alternative that brought Lee's sudden surrender. Either the South must make terms with its slaves, free them, use them to fight the North, and thereafter no longer treat them as bondsmen, or they could surrender to the North with the assumption that the North, after the war, must help them to defend slavery as it had before. George Rowick, a sociologist and anthropologist, describes the development of blacks up to and into the Civil War. The slaves went from being frightened human beings, thrown among strange men, including fellow slaves who were not their kinsmen, and who did not speak their language or understand their customs and habits, to what W.E.B. Du Bois once described as the general strike, whereby hundreds of thousands of slaves deserted the plantations, destroying the South's ability to supply its army. Black women played an important part in the war, especially toward the end. Sojourner Truth, the legendary ex-slave who had been active in the women's rights movement, became recruiter of black troops for the Union Army, as did Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin of Boston. Harriet Tubman raided plantations, leading black and white troops, and in one expedition freed 750 slaves. Women moved with the colored regiments that grew as the Union Army marched through the South, helping their husbands, enduring terrible hardships on the long military treks in which many children died. They suffered the fate of soldiers, as in April 1864, when Confederate troops at Fort Pillow, Kentucky, massacred Union soldiers who had surrendered, black and white, along with women and children in an adjoining camp. It has been said that black acceptance of slavery is proved by the fact that during the Civil War, when there were opportunities for escape, most slaves stayed on the plantation. In fact, 500,000 ran away, about 1 in 5, a high proportion when one considers that there was great difficulty in knowing where to go and how to live. The owner of a large plantation in South Carolina and Georgia wrote in 1862, "This war has taught us the perfect impossibility of placing the least confidence in the Negro. In too numerous instances, those we esteem the most have been the first to desert us." That same year, a lieutenant in the Confederate Army and once mayor of Savannah, Georgia, wrote, "I deeply regret to learn that the Negroes still continue to desert to the enemy." A minister in Mississippi wrote in the fall of 1862, "On my arrival, was surprised to hear that our Negroes stampeded to the Yankees last night, or rather a portion of them. I think every one, but with one or two exceptions, will go to the Yankees. Eliza and her family are certain to go. She does not conceal her thoughts, but plainly manifests her opinions by her conduct, insolent and insulting." In a Woman's Plantation Journal of January 1865, "The people are all idle on the plantations, most of them seeking their own pleasure. Many servants have proven faithful, others false and rebellious against all authority and restraint. Their condition is one of perfect anarchy and rebellion. They have placed themselves in perfect antagonism to their owners and to all government and control. Nearly all the house servants have left their homes, and from most of the plantations they have gone in a body." Also in 1865, a South Carolina planter wrote to the New York Tribune that, "The conduct of the Negro in the late crisis of our affairs has convinced me that we are all laboring under a delusion. I believed that these people were content, happy, and attached to their masters. But events and reflection have caused me to change these positions. If they were content, happy, and attached to their masters, why did they desert him in the moment of his need and flock to an enemy whom they did not know, and thus left their perhaps really good masters whom they did know from infancy?" Genovese notes that the war produced no general rising of slaves, but in Lafayette County, Mississippi, slaves responded to the Emancipation Proclamation by driving off their overseers and dividing the land and implements among themselves. Aptheker reports a conspiracy of Negroes in Arkansas in 1861 to kill their enslavers. In Kentucky that year, houses and barns were burned by Negroes, and in the city of Newcastle, slaves paraded through the city, singing political songs and shouting for Lincoln, according to newspaper accounts. After the Emancipation Proclamation, a Negro waiter in Richmond, Virginia, was arrested for leading a servile plot, while in Yazoo City, Mississippi, slaves burned the courthouse and 14 homes. There were special moments. Robert Smalls, later a South Carolina congressman, and other blacks took over a steamship, the Planter, and sailed it past the Confederate guns to deliver it to the Union Navy. Most slaves neither submitted nor rebelled. They continued to work, waiting to see what happened. When opportunity came, they left, often joining the Union Army. 200,000 blacks were in the Army and Navy, and 38,000 were killed. Historian James McPherson says, "Without their help, the North could not have won the war as soon as it did, and perhaps it could not have won at all." What happened to blacks in the Union Army and in the northern cities during the war gave some hint of how limited the emancipation would be, even with full victory over the Confederacy. Off-duty black soldiers were attacked in northern cities, as in Zanesville, Ohio in February 1864, where cries were heard to "kill the nigger." Black soldiers were used for the heaviest and dirtiest work, digging trenches, hauling logs and cannon, loading ammunition, digging wells for white regiments. White privates received $13 a month. Negro privates received $10 a month. Late in the war, a black sergeant of the 3rd South Carolina Volunteers, William Walker, marched his company to his captain's tent and ordered them to stack arms and resign from the Army as a protest against what he considered a breach of contract because of unequal pay. He was court-martialed and shot for mutiny. Finally, in June 1864, Congress passed a law granting equal pay to Negro soldiers. The Confederacy was desperate in the latter part of the war, and some of its leaders suggested the slaves, more and more an obstacle to their cause, be enlisted, used, and freed. After a number of military defeats, the Confederate Secretary of War, Judah Benjamin, wrote in late 1864 to a newspaper editor in Charleston, "It is well known that General Lee, who commands so largely the confidence of the people, is strongly in favor of our using the Negroes for defense and emancipating them if necessary for that purpose." One general, indignant, wrote, "If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." By early 1865, the pressure had mounted, and in March, President Davis of the Confederacy signed a Negro Soldier Law, authorizing the enlistment of slaves as soldiers to be freed by consent of their owners and their state governments. But before it had any significant effect, the war was over. Former slaves, interviewed by the Federal Writers Project in the 30s, recalled the war's end. Susie Melton. I was a young gal, about 10 years old, and we done heard that Lincoln gonna turn the niggers free. Old Mrs. says there wasn't nothing to it. Then a Yankee soldier told someone in Williamsburg that Lincoln done signed the Emancipation. Was wintertime and mighty cold that night, but everybody commenced getting ready to leave. Didn't care nothing about Mrs. Was going to the Union lines, and all that night the niggers danced and sang right out in the cold. Next morning at daybreak, we all started out with blankets and clothes and pots and pans and chickens piled on our backs, because Mrs. said that we couldn't take no horses or carts. And as the sun come up over the trees, the niggers started to singing. Son, you be here and I'll be gone. Son, you be here and I'll be gone. Son, you be here and I'll be gone. Bye-bye, don't grieve after me. Won't give you my place, not for yours. Bye-bye, don't grieve after me, 'cause you be here and I'll be gone. Anna Woods. We wasn't there in Texas long when the soldiers marched in to tell us that we were free. I remembers one woman. She jumped on a barrel and she shouted. She jumped off and she shouted. She jumped back on again and shouted some more. She kept that up for a long time, just jumping on a barrel and back off again. Annie Mae Weathers said, I remember hearing my pa say that when somebody came and hollered, "You niggers is free at last," say he just dropped his hoe and said in a queer voice, "Thank God for that." The Federal Writers Project recorded an ex-slave named Fanny Berry. Niggers shouting and clapping hands and singing, children running all over the place, beating time and yelling, everybody happy. Show did some celebration. Run to the kitchen and shout in the window, "Mammy, don't you cook no more. You's free. You's free." Many Negroes understood that their status after the war, whatever their situation legally, would depend on whether they owned the land they worked on or would be forced to be semi-slaves for others. In 1863, a North Carolina Negro wrote that, "If the strict law of right and justice is to be observed, the country around me is the entailed inheritance of the Americans of African descent, purchased by the invaluable labor of our ancestors through a life of tears and groans under the lash and yoke of tyranny." Abandoned plantations, however, were leased to former planters and to white men of the North. As one colored newspaper said, "The slaves were made serfs and chained to the soil. Such was the boasted freedom acquired by the colored man at the hands of the Yankee." Under congressional policy approved by Lincoln, the property confiscated during the war under the Confiscation Act of July 1862 would revert to the heirs of the Confederate owners. Dr. John Rock, a black physician in Boston, spoke at a meeting. "Why talk about compensating masters? Compensate them for what? What do we owe them? What does the slave owe them? What does society owe them? Compensate the master? It is the slave who ought to be compensated. The property of the South is by right the property of the slave." Some land was expropriated on grounds the taxes were delinquent and sold at auction, but only a few blacks could afford to buy this. In the South Carolina Sea Islands, out of 16,000 acres up for sale in March of 1863, freedmen who pooled their money were able to buy 2,000 acres, the rest being bought by northern investors and speculators. A freedman on the islands dictated a letter to a former teacher now in Philadelphia. "My dear young missus, do my missus tell Lincoln that we wants land. This very land that is rich with the sweat of the face and the blood of the back. We could have been buy all we want, but they make the lots too big and cut we out. The word come from Mass Lincoln himself that we take out claims and hold on to 'em and plant 'em, and he will see that we get 'em, every man 10 or 20 acre. We too glad. We stake out and list, but before the time for plan, these commissionaries sell to the white folks all the best land. Where Lincoln?" In early 1865, General William T. Sherman held a conference in Savannah, Georgia, with 20 Negro ministers and church officials, mostly former slaves, at which one of them expressed their need. The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land, and till it by our labor. 4 days later, Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, designating the entire southern coastline, 30 miles inland, for exclusive Negro settlement. Freedmen could settle there, taking no more than 40 acres per family. By June 1865, 40,000 freedmen had moved onto new farms in this area. But President Andrew Johnson, in August of 1865, restored this land to the Confederate owners, and the freedmen were forced off, some at bayonet point. Ex-slave Thomas Hall told the Federal Writers Project, "Lincoln got the praise for freeing us, but did he do it? He gave us freedom without giving us any chance to live to ourselves, and we still had to depend on the Southern white man for work, food, and clothing, and he held us out of necessity and went in a state of servitude, but little better than slavery." The American government had set out to fight the slave states in 1861, not to end slavery, but to retain the enormous national territory and market and resources. Yet, victory required a crusade, and the momentum of that crusade brought new forces into national politics. More blacks determined to make their freedom mean something. More whites, whether Freedmen's Bureau officials or teachers in the Sea Islands or carpetbaggers with various mixtures of humanitarianism and personal ambition, concerned with racial equality. There was also the powerful interest of the Republican Party in maintaining control over the national government, with the prospect of Southern black votes to accomplish this. Northern businessmen, seeing Republican policies as beneficial to them, went along for a while. The result was that brief period after the Civil War, in which Southern Negroes voted, elected blacks to state legislatures and to Congress, introduced free and racially mixed public education to the South. A legal framework was constructed. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The 14th Amendment repudiated the pre-war Dred Scott decision by declaring that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens. It also seemed to make a powerful statement for racial equality, severely limiting states' rights. "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." The 15th Amendment said, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Congress passed a number of laws in the late 1860s and early 1870s in the same spirit, laws making it a crime to deprive Negroes of their rights, requiring federal officials to enforce those rights, giving Negroes the right to enter contracts and buy property without discrimination. And in 1875, a Civil Rights Act outlawed the exclusion of Negroes from hotels, theaters, railroads, and other public accommodations. With these laws, with the Union Army in the South as protection, and a civilian army of officials in the Freedmen's Bureau to help them, Southern Negroes came forward, voted, formed political organizations, and expressed themselves forcefully on issues important to them. They were hampered in this for several years by Andrew Johnson, vice president under Lincoln, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated at the close of the war. Johnson vetoed bills to help Negroes. He made it easy for Confederate states to come back into the Union without guaranteeing equal rights to blacks. During his presidency, these returned Southern states enacted black codes, which made the freed slaves like serfs, still working the plantations. For instance, Mississippi in 1865 made it illegal for freedmen to rent or lease farmland and provided for them to work under labor contracts, which they could not break under penalty of prison. It also provided that the courts could assign black children under 18 who had no parents or whose parents were poor to forced labor called apprenticeships, with punishment for runaways. Andrew Johnson clashed with senators and congressmen who, in some cases for reasons of justice, in others out of political calculation, supported equal rights and voting for the freedmen. These members of Congress succeeded in impeaching Johnson in 1868, using as an excuse that he had violated some minor statute. But the Senate fell one vote short of the 2/3 required to remove him from office. In the presidential election of that year, Republican Ulysses Grant was elected, winning 300,000 votes, with 700,000 Negroes voting, and so Johnson was out as an obstacle. Now the Southern states could come back into the Union only by approving the new constitutional amendments. Whatever Northern politicians were doing to help their cause, Southern blacks were determined to make the most of their freedom, in spite of their lack of land and resources. A study of blacks in Alabama in the first years after the war by historian Peter Colchin finds that they began immediately asserting their independence of whites, forming their own churches, becoming politically active, strengthening their family ties, trying to educate their children. Colchin disagrees with the contention of some historians that slavery had created a Sambo mentality of submission among blacks. As soon as they were free, these supposedly dependent, childlike Negroes began acting like independent men and women. Negroes were now elected to Southern state legislatures, although in these they were a minority, except in the lower house of the South Carolina legislature. A great propaganda campaign was undertaken north and south, one which lasted well into the 20th century in the history textbooks of American schools, to show that blacks were inept, lazy, corrupt, and ruinous to the governments of the South when they were in office. Undoubtedly there was corruption, but one could hardly claim that blacks had invented political conniving, especially in the bizarre climate of financial finagling North and South after the Civil War. It was true that the public debt of South Carolina, $7 million in 1865, went up to $29 million in 1873. But the new legislature introduced free public schools for the first time into the state. Not only were 70,000 Negro children going to school by 1876, where none had gone before, but 50,000 white children were going to school where only 20,000 had attended in 1860. Black voting in the period after 1869 resulted in 2 Negro members of the U.S. Senate, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, both from Mississippi, and 20 congressmen, including 8 from South Carolina, 4 from North Carolina, 3 from Alabama, and 1 each from the other former Confederate states. This list would dwindle rapidly after 1876, the last black left Congress in 1901. A Columbia University scholar of the 20th century, John Burgess, referred to black Reconstruction as follows: "In place of government by the most intelligent and virtuous part of the people for the benefit of the governed, here was government by the most ignorant and vicious part of the population. A black skin means membership in a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason, has never, therefore, created civilization of any kind." One has to measure against those words the black leaders in the post-war South. For instance, Henry McNeil Turner, who had escaped from peonage on a South Carolina plantation at the age of 15, taught himself to read and write, read law books while a messenger in a lawyer's office in Baltimore, and medical books while a handyman in a Baltimore medical school, served as chaplain to a Negro regiment, and then was elected to the first post-war legislature of Georgia. In 1868, the Georgia legislature voted to expel all its Negro members, 2 senators, 25 representatives, and Turner spoke to the Georgia House of Representatives. A black woman graduate student at Atlanta University later brought his speech to light. "Mr. Speaker, I wish the members of this House to understand the position that I take. I hold that I am a member of this body. Therefore, sir, I shall neither fawn or cringe before any party, nor stoop to beg them for my rights. I am here to demand my rights and to hurl thunderbolts at the men who would dare to cross the threshold of my manhood. The scene presented in this house today is one unparalleled in the history of the world. Never in the history of the world has a man been arraigned before a body clothed with legislative, judicial, or executive functions, charged with the offense of being of a darker hue than his fellow men. It has remained for the state of Georgia, in the very heart of the 19th century, to call a man before the bar and there charge him with an act for which he is no more responsible than for the head which he carries upon his shoulders. The Anglo-Saxon race, sir, is a most surprising one. I was not aware that there was in the character of that race so much cowardice or so much pusillanimity. I tell you, sir, that this is a question which will not die today. This event shall be remembered by posterity for ages yet to come, and while the sun shall continue to climb the hills of heaven. We are told that if black men want to speak, they must speak through white trumpets. If black men want their sentiments expressed, they must be adulterated and sent through white messengers who will quibble and equivocate and evade as rapidly as the pendulum of a clock. The great question, sir, is this: am I a man? If I am such, I claim the rights of a man. Why, sir, though we are not white, we have accomplished much. We have pioneered civilization here. We have built up your country. We have worked in your fields and garnered your harvests for 250 years. And what do we ask of you in return? Do we ask you for compensation for the sweat our fathers bore for you, for the tears you have caused, and the hearts you have broken, and the lives you have curtailed, and the blood you have spilled? Do we ask retaliation? We ask it not. We are willing to let the dead past bury its dead. But we ask you now for our rights. As black children went to school, they were encouraged by teachers, black and white, to express themselves freely, sometimes in catechism style. The records of a school in Louisville, Kentucky. Teacher: now, children, you don't think white people are any better than you because they have straight hair and white faces. Students: no, sir. Teacher: no, they are no better, but they are different. They possess great power. They form this great government. They control this vast country. Now, what makes them different from you? Students: money. Teacher: yes, but what enabled them to obtain it? How did they get money? Students: got it off us. Stole it off we all. Black women helped rebuild the post-war South. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, born free in Baltimore, self-supporting from the age of 13, working as a nursemaid, later as an abolitionist lecturer, reader of her own poetry, spoke all through the southern states after the war. She was a feminist, participant in the 1866 Women's Rights Convention, and founder of the National Association of Colored Women. In the 1890s, she wrote the first novel published by a black woman, Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted. In 1878, she described what she had seen and heard recently in the South. An acquaintance of mine who lives in South Carolina and has been engaged in mission work reports that in supporting the family, women are the mainstay, that 2/3 of the truck gardening is done by them in South Carolina, that in the city they are more industrious than the men. When the men lose their work through their political affiliations, the women stand by them and say, "Stand by your principles." Through all the struggles to gain equal rights for blacks, certain black women spoke out on their special situation. Sojourner Truth, at a meeting of the American Equal Rights Association, said, "There is a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. And if colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. So I am for keeping the thing going while things are stirring, because if we wait till it is still, it'll take a great while to get it going again. I am above 80 years old. It is about time for me to be going. I have been 40 years a slave and 40 years free, and would be here 40 years more to have equal rights for all. I suppose I am kept here because something remains for me to do. I suppose I am yet to help break the chain. I have done a great deal of work, as much as a man, but did not get so much pay. I used to work in the field and bind grain, keeping with the cradler, but men doing no more got twice as much pay. I suppose I am about the only colored woman that goes about to speak for the rights of the colored women. I want to keep things stirring now that the ice is cracked. The constitutional amendments were passed, the laws for racial equality were passed, and the black man began to vote and hold office. But so long as the Negro remained dependent on privileged whites for work, for the necessities of life, his vote could be bought or taken away by threat of force. Thus, laws calling for equal treatment became meaningless. While Union troops, including colored troops, remained in the South, this process was delayed, but the balance of military powers began to change. The Southern white oligarchy used its economic power to organize the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups. Northern politicians began to weigh the advantage of the political support of impoverished blacks, maintained in voting in office only by force, against the more stable situation of a South returned to white supremacy, accepting Republican dominance and business legislation. It was only a matter of time before blacks would be reduced once again to conditions not far from slavery. Violence began almost immediately with the end of the war. In Memphis, Tennessee, in May of 1866, whites on a rampage of murder killed 46 Negroes, most of them veterans of the Union Army, as well as 2 white sympathizers. 5 Negro women were raped. 90 homes, 12 schools, and 4 churches were burned. In New Orleans in the summer of 1866, another riot against blacks killed 35 Negroes and 3 whites. Mrs. Sarah Song testified before a congressional investigating committee. "Have you been a slave?" "I have been a slave." "What did you see of the rioting?" "I saw them kill my husband. It was on a Tuesday night, between 10 and 11 o'clock. He was shot in the head while he was in bed sick. There were between 20 and 30 men. They came into the room. Then one stepped back and shot him. He was not a yard from him. He put the pistol to his head and shot him 3 times. Then one of them kicked him and another shot him again when he was down. He never spoke after he fell. They then went running right off and did not come back again." The violence mounted through the late 1860s and early 1870s as the Ku Klux Klan organized raids, lynchings, beatings, burnings. For Kentucky alone, between 1867 and 1871, the National Archives lists 116 acts of violence. A sampling. Number 1. A mob visited Harrodsburg in Mercer County to take from jail a man named Robertson, November 14, 1867. Number 5. Sam Davis, hung by a mob in Harrodsburg, May 28, 1868. Number 6. William Pierce, hung by a mob in Christian, July 12, 1868. Number 7. George Roger, hung by a mob in Bradsfordville, Martin County, July 11, 1868. Number 10. Silas Woodford, age 60, badly beaten by disguised mob. 109. Negro killed by Ku Klux Klan in Hay County, January 14, 1871. A Negro blacksmith named Charles Caldwell, born a slave, later elected to the Mississippi Senate, and known as a notorious and turbulent Negro by whites, was shot at by the son of a white Mississippi judge in 1868. Caldwell fired back and killed the man. Tried by an all-white jury, he argued self-defense and was acquitted, the first Negro to kill a white in Mississippi and go free after trial. But on Christmas Day, 1875, Caldwell was shot to death by a white gang. It was a sign. The old white rulers were taking back political power in Mississippi and everywhere else in the South. As white violence rose in the 1870s, the national government, even under President Grant, became less enthusiastic about defending blacks and certainly not prepared to arm them. The Supreme Court played its gyroscopic role of pulling the other branches of government back to more conservative directions when they went too far. It began interpreting the 14th Amendment, passed presumably for racial equality, in a way that made it impotent for this purpose. In 1883, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, outlawing discrimination against Negroes using public facilities, was nullified by the Supreme Court, which said, individual invasion of individual rights is not the subject matter of the amendment. The 14th Amendment, it said, was aimed at state action only. No state shall. A remarkable dissent was written by Supreme Court Justice John Harlan, himself a former slave owner in Kentucky, who said there was constitutional justification for banning private discrimination. He noted that the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, applied to individual plantation owners, not just the state. He then argued that discrimination was a badge of slavery and similarly outlawable. He pointed also to the first clause of the 14th Amendment, saying that anyone born in the United States was a citizen, and to the clause in Article 4, Section 2, saying, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Harlan was fighting a force greater than logic or justice. The mood of the court reflected a new coalition of northern industrialists and southern businessmen planters. The culmination of this mood came in the decision of 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, when the court ruled that a railroad could segregate black and white if the segregated facilities were equal. The object of the amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color, or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality, or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Harlan again dissented. Our Constitution is colorblind. It was the year 1877 that spelled out clearly and dramatically what was happening. When the year opened, the presidential election of the past November was in bitter dispute. The Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden, had 184 votes and needed one more to be elected. His popular vote was greater by 250,000. The Republican candidate, Rutherford Hayes, had 166 electoral votes. 3 states not yet counted had a total of 19 electoral votes. If Hayes could get all of those, he would have 185 and be president. This is what his managers proceeded to arrange. They made concessions to the Democratic Party and the white South, including an agreement to remove Union troops from the South, the last military obstacle to the re-establishment of white supremacy there. Northern political and economic interests needed powerful allies and stability in the face of national crisis. The country had been in economic depression since 1873, and by 1877, farmers and workers were beginning to rebel. As C. Van Woodward puts it in his history of the 1877 Compromise, Reunion and Reaction, As C. Van Woodward puts it in his history of the 1877 Compromise, Reunion and Reaction, it was a depression year, the worst year of the severest depression yet experienced. In the East, labor and the unemployed were in a bitter and violent temper. Out West, a tide of agrarian radicalism was rising. From both East and West came threats against the elaborate structure of protective tariffs, national banks, railroad subsidies, and monetary arrangements upon which the new economic order was founded. It was a time for reconciliation between Southern and Northern elites. Woodward asks, could the South be induced to combine with the Northern conservatives and become a prop instead of a menace to the new capitalist order? With billions of dollars worth of slaves gone, the wealth of the Old South was wiped out. They now looked to the national government for help, credit, subsidies, flood control projects. The United States in 1865 had spent $103,294,501 on public works, but the South received only $9,469,363. For instance, while Ohio got over $1 million, Kentucky, her neighbor south of the river, got $25,000. While Maine got $3 million, Mississippi got $136,000. While $83 million had been given to subsidize the Union Pacific and Central Pacific railroads, thus creating a transcontinental railroad through the North, There was no such subsidy for the South. So one of the things the South looked for was federal aid to the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Woodward says, by means of appropriations, subsidies, grants, and bonds, such as Congress had so lavishly showered upon capitalist enterprise in the North, the South might yet mend its fortunes, or at any rate the fortunes of a privileged elite. These privileges were sought with the backing of poor white farmers, brought into the new alliance against blacks. The farmers wanted railroads, harbor improvements, flood control, and, of course, land, not knowing yet how these would be used, not to help them, but to exploit them. For example, as the first act of the new North-South capitalist cooperation, the Southern Homestead Act, which had reserved all federal lands, 1/3 of the area of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, for farmers who would work the land, was repealed. This enabled absentee speculators and lumbermen to move in and buy up much of this land. And so the deal was made. The proper committee was set up by both houses of Congress to decide where the electoral votes would go. The decision was they belonged to Hayes, and he was now president. As Woodward sums it up, the Compromise of 1877 did not restore the old order in the South. It did assure the dominant whites political autonomy and non-intervention in matters of race policy, and promised them a share in the blessings of the new economic order. In return, the South became, in effect, a satellite of the dominant region. The importance of the new capitalism in overturning what black power existed in the post-war South is affirmed by Horace Mann Bond's study of Alabama Reconstruction, which shows, after 1868, a struggle between different financiers. Yes, racism was a factor, but accumulations of capital and the men who controlled them were as unaffected by attitudinal prejudices as it is possible to be. Without sentiment, without emotion, those who sought profit from an exploitation of Alabama's natural resources turned other men's prejudices and attitudes to their own account, and did so with skill and ruthless acumen. It was an age of coal and power, and northern Alabama had both. The bankers in Philadelphia and New York, and even in London and Paris, had known this for almost 2 decades. The only thing lacking was transportation. And so, in the mid-1870s, Bond notes, northern bankers began appearing in the directories of southern railroad lines. J.P. Morgan appears by 1875 as director for several lines in Alabama and Georgia. In the year 1886, Henry Grady, an editor of the Atlanta Constitution, spoke at a dinner in New York. In the audience were J.P. Morgan, H.M. Flagler, an associate of Rockefeller, Russell Sage, and Charles Tiffany. His talk was called The New South, and his theme was, "Let bygones be bygones. Let us have a new era of peace and prosperity." The Negro was a prosperous laboring class. He had the fullest protection of the laws and the friendship of the Southern people. Grady joked about the Northerners who sold slaves to the South and said the South could now handle its own race problem. He received a rising ovation, and the band played Dixie. That same month, an article in the New York Daily Tribune. The leading coal and iron men of the South, who have been in this city during the last 10 days, will go home to spend the Christmas holidays thoroughly satisfied with the business of the year and more than hopeful for the future. And they have good reason to be. The time for which they have been waiting for nearly 20 years, when northern capitalists would be convinced not only of the safety, but of the immense profits to be gained from the investment of their money in developing the fabulously rich coal and iron resources of Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia, has come at last. The North, it must be recalled, did not have to undergo a revolution in its thinking to accept the subordination of the Negro. When the Civil War ended, 19 of the 24 northern states did not allow blacks to vote. By 1900, all the southern states, in new constitutions and new statutes, had written into law the disenfranchisement and segregation of Negroes. And a New York Times editorial said, "Northern men no longer denounce the suppression of the Negro vote. The necessity of it under the supreme law of self-preservation is candidly recognized." While not written into law in the North, The counterpart in racist thought and practice was there. An item in the Boston Transcript, September 25, 1895. A colored man who gives his name as Henry W. Turner was arrested last night on suspicion of being a highway robber. He was taken this morning to Black's studio, where he had his picture taken for the Rogues Gallery. That angered him, and he made himself as disagreeable as he possibly could. Several times along the way to the photographers, he resisted the police with all his might and had to be clubbed. In the post-war literature, images of the Negro came mostly from Southern white writers like Thomas Nelson Page, who in his novel, Red Rock, referred to a Negro character as a hyena in a cage, a reptile, a species of worm, a wild beast. And interspersed with paternalistic urgings of friendship for the Negro, Joel Chandler Harris, in his Uncle Remus stories, would have Uncle Remus say, "Put a spelling book in a nigger's hands, and right then and there you loses a plow hand. I can take a barrel stave and fling more sense into a nigger in 1 minute than all the schoolhouses between this and the state of Michigan." In this atmosphere, it was no wonder that those Negro leaders most accepted in white society, like the educator Booker T. Washington, a one-time White House guest of Theodore Roosevelt, urged Negro political passivity. Invited by the white organizers of the Cotton States, an international exposition in Atlanta in 1895 to speak, Washington urged the Southern Negro to cast down your bucket where you are. That is, to stay in the South, to be farmers, mechanics, domestics, perhaps even to attain to the professions. He urged white employers to hire Negroes rather than immigrants of strange tongue and habits. Negroes, without strikes and labor wars, were the most patient, faithful, law-abiding, and unresentful people that the world has seen. He said, "The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly." Perhaps Washington saw this as a necessary tactic of survival in a time of hangings and burnings of Negroes throughout the South. It was a low point for black people in America. Thomas Fortune, a young black editor of the New York Globe, testified before a Senate committee in 1883 about the situation of the Negro in the United States. He spoke of widespread poverty, of government betrayal, of desperate Negro attempts to educate themselves. The average wage of Negro farm laborers in the South was about 50 cents a day, Fortune said. He was usually paid in orders, not money, which he could use only at a store controlled by the planter, a system of fraud. The Negro farmer, to get the wherewithal to plant his crop, had to promise it to the store, and when everything was added up at the end of the year, he was in debt, so his crop was constantly owed to someone, and he was tied to the land, with the records kept by the planter and storekeeper, so that the Negroes are swindled and kept forever in debt. As for supposed laziness, I am surprised that a larger number of them do not go to fishing, hunting, and loafing. Fortune spoke of the penitentiary system of the South, with its infamous chain gang, the object being to terrorize the blacks and furnish victims for contractors who purchase the labor of these wretches from the state for a song. The white man who shoots a Negro always goes free, while the Negro who steals a hog is sent to the chain gang for 10 years. Many Negroes fled. About 6,000 black people left Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and migrated to Kansas to escape violence and poverty. Frederick Douglass and some other leaders thought this was a wrong tactic, but migrants rejected such advice. "We have found no leader to trust but God overhead of us," one said. Henry Adams, another black migrant, illiterate, a veteran of the Union Army, told a Senate committee in 1880 why he left Shreveport, Louisiana. "We see that the whole South, every state in the South, had got into the hands of the very men that held us slaves." Even in the worst periods, Southern Negroes continued to meet, to organize in self-defense. Herbert Aptheker reprints 13 documents of meetings, petitions, and appeals of Negroes in the 1880s in Baltimore, Louisiana, the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, Florida, Texas, Kansas, showing the spirit of defiance and resistance of blacks all over the South. This in the face of over 100 lynchings a year by this time. Despite the apparent hopelessness of this situation, There were black leaders who thought Booker T. Washington wrong in advocating caution and moderation. John Hope, a young black man in Georgia, who heard Washington's Cotton Exposition speech, told students at a Negro college in Nashville, Tennessee, "If we are not striving for equality, in heaven's name, for what are we living? I regard it as cowardly and dishonest for any of our colored men to tell white people or colored people that we are not struggling for equality. Yes, my friends, I want equality, nothing less. Now, catch your breath, for I am going to use an adjective. I am going to say we demand social equality. I am no wild beast, nor am I an unclean thing. Rise, brothers. Come, let us possess this land. Be discontented. Be dissatisfied. Be as restless as the tempestuous billows on the boundless sea. Let your discontent break mountain high against the wall of prejudice and swamp it to the very foundation." Another black man who came to teach at Atlanta University, W.E.B. Du Bois, saw the late 19th century betrayal of the Negro as part of a larger happening in the United States, something happening not only to poor blacks, but to poor whites. In his book, Black Reconstruction, written in 1935, he said, "God wept, but that mattered little to an unbelieving age. What mattered most was that the world wept and still is weeping and blind with tears and blood. For there began to rise in America in 1876 a new capitalism and a new enslavement of labor." Du Bois saw this new capitalism as part of a process of exploitation and bribery taking place in all the civilized countries of the world. Home labor in cultured lands, appeased and misled by a ballot whose power the dictatorship of vast capital strictly curtailed, was bribed by high wage and political office to unite in an exploitation of white, yellow, brown, and black labor in lesser hands. Was Du Bois right that in that growth of American capitalism before and after the Civil War, whites as well as blacks were in some sense becoming slaves? Chapter 10. The Other Civil War. A sheriff in the Hudson River Valley near Albany, New York, about to go into the hills in the fall of 1839 to collect back rents from tenants on the enormous Rensselaer estate, was handed a letter. The tenants have organized themselves into a body and resolved not to pay any more rent until they can be redressed of their grievances. The tenants now assume the right of doing to their landlord as he has for a long time done for them, viz., as they please. You need not think this to be child's play. If you come out in your official capacity, I would not pledge for your safe return. A tenant. When a deputy arrived in the farming area with writs demanding the rent, farmers suddenly appeared, assembled by the blowing of tin horns. They seized his writs and burned them. That December, a sheriff and a mounted posse of 500 rode into the farm country, but found themselves in the midst of shrieking tin horns, 1,800 farmers blocking their path, 600 more blocking their rear, all mounted, armed with pitchforks and clubs. The sheriff and his posse turned back, the rear guard parting to let them through. This was the start of the anti-renter movement in the Hudson Valley, described by Henry Christman in Tin Horns and Calico. It was a protest against the patroonship system, which went back to the 1600s when the Dutch ruled New York, a system where, as Christman describes it, a few families, intricately intermarried, controlled the destinies of 300,000 people and ruled in almost kingly splendor nearly 2 million acres of land. The tenants paid taxes and rents. The largest manor was owned by the Rensselaer family, which ruled over about 80,000 tenants and had accumulated a fortune of $41 million. The landowner, as one sympathizer of the tenants put it, could swill his wine, loll on his cushions, fill his life with society, food, and culture, and ride his barouche and 5 saddle horses along the beautiful river valley and up to the backdrop of the mountain. By the summer of 1839, the tenants were holding their first mass meeting. The economic crisis of 1837 had filled the area with unemployed seeking land, on top of the layoffs accompanying the completion of the Erie Canal after the first wave of railroad building ended. That summer, the tenants resolved, "We will take up the ball of the revolution where our fathers stopped it, and roll it to the final consummation of freedom and independence of the masses." Certain men in the farm country became leaders and organizers. Smith Boughton, a country doctor on horseback; Ainge de Vere, a revolutionary Irishman. De Vere had seen monopoly of land and industry bring misery to the slum dwellers of London, Liverpool, and Glasgow, had agitated for change, had been arrested for sedition, and fled to America. He was invited to address a 4th of July rally of farmers in Rensselaerville, where he warned his listeners, "If you permit unprincipled and ambitious men to monopolize the soil, they will become masters of the country in the certain order of cause and effect." Thousands of farmers in Rensselaer country were organized into anti-rent associations to prevent the landlords from evicting. They agreed on calico Indian costumes, symbol of the Boston Tea Party, and recalling original ownership of the soil. The tin horn represented an Indian call to arms. Soon, 10,000 men were trained and ready. Organizing went on in county after county, in dozens of towns along the Hudson. Handbills appeared. "Attention, anti-renters, awake, arouse. Strike till the last armed foe expires. Strike for your altars and your fires. Strike for the green graves of your sires, God and your happy homes." Sheriffs and deputy sheriffs trying to serve writs on farmers were surrounded by calico-clad riders who had been summoned by tin horns sounding in the countryside, then tarred and feathered. The New York Herald, once sympathetic, now deplored the insurrectionary spirit of the mountaineers. One of the most hated elements of the lease gave the landlord the right to the timber on all the farms. A man sent onto a tenant's land to gather wood for the landlord was killed. Tension rose. A farm boy was killed mysteriously. No one knew by whom. But Dr. Boughton was jailed. The governor ordered artillerymen into action, and a company of cavalry came up from New York City. Petitions for an anti-rent bill, signed by 25,000 tenants, were put before the legislature in 1845. The bill was defeated. A kind of guerrilla war resumed in the country between bands of Indians and sheriff's posses. Boughton was kept in jail 7 months, 4.5 months of that in heavy irons, before being released on bail. 4th of July meetings in 1845, attended by thousands of farmers, pledged continued resistance. When a deputy sheriff tried to sell the livestock of a farmer named Moses Earl, who owed $60 rent on 160 stony acres, there was a fight and the deputy was killed. Similar attempts to sell livestock for rent payments were thwarted again and again. The governor sent 300 troops in, declaring a state of rebellion existed, and soon almost 100 anti-renters went to jail. Smith Boughton was brought to trial. He was charged with taking papers from a sheriff, but declared by the judge to have in fact committed high treason, rebellion against your government, and armed insurrection, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Those Indians found to be armed and disguised at Moses Earl's farm, where the deputy had been killed, were declared by the judge to be guilty of murder, and the jury was so instructed. All were found guilty, and the judge sentenced 4 to life imprisonment and 2 to be hanged. 2 of the leaders were told to write letters urging the anti-renters to disband as their only chance to escape heavy sentences. They wrote the letters. The power of the law thus crushed the anti-rent movement. It was intended to make clear that farmers could not win by fighting, that they must confine their efforts to voting, to acceptable methods of reform. In 1845, the anti-renters elected 14 members to the state legislature. Governor Silas Wright now commuted to life imprisonment the 2 death sentences and asked the legislature to give relief to the tenants, to end the feudal system in the Hudson Valley. Proposals to break up the huge estates on the death of the owners were defeated, but the legislature voted to make illegal the selling of tenant property for non-payment of rent. A constitutional convention that year outlawed new feudal leases. The next governor, elected in 1846 with anti-rent support, had promised to pardon the anti-rent prisoners, and he did. Throngs of farmers greeted them on their release. Court decisions in the 1850s began to limit the worst features of the manorial system without changing the fundamentals of landlord-tenant relations. Sporadic farmer resistance to the collection of back rents continued into the 1860s. As late as 1869, bands of Indians were still assembling to thwart sheriffs acting for a rich valley landowner named Walter Church. In the early 1880s, a deputy sheriff trying to dispossess a farmer on behalf of Church was killed by shotgun fire. By this time, most leases had passed into the hands of the farmers. In 3 of the main anti-rent counties, of 12,000 farmers, only 2,000 remained under lease. The farmers had fought, been crushed by the law, their struggle diverted into voting, and the system stabilized by enlarging the class of small landowners, leaving the basic structure of rich and poor intact. It was a common sequence in American history. Around the time of the anti-renter movement in New York, there was excitement in Rhode Island over Dorr's rebellion. As Marvin Gettleman points out in The Dorr Rebellion, it was both a movement for electoral reform and an example of radical insurgency. It was prompted by the Rhode Island Charter's rule that only owners of land could vote. As more people left the farm for the city, as immigrants came to work in the mills, the disenfranchised grew. Seth Luther, self-educated carpenter in Providence and spokesman for working people, wrote in 1833 the Address on the Right of Free Suffrage, denouncing the monopoly of political power by the mushroom lordlings, sprigs of nobility, small potato aristocrats of Rhode Island. He urged non-cooperation with the government, refusing to pay taxes or to serve in the militia. Why, he asked, should 12,000 working people in Rhode Island, without the vote, submit to 5,000 who had land and could vote? Thomas Dorr, a lawyer from a well-to-do family, became a leader of the suffrage movement. Working people formed the Rhode Island Suffrage Association, and in the spring of 1841, thousands paraded in Providence carrying banners and signs for electoral reform. Going outside the legal system, they organized their own People's Convention and drafted a new constitution without property qualifications for voting. In early 1842, they invited votes on the Constitution. 14,000 voted for it, including about 5,000 with property. Therefore, a majority, even of those legally entitled to vote by the charter. In April, they held an unofficial election in which Dorr ran unopposed for governor, and 6,000 people voted for him. The governor of Rhode Island, in the meantime, got the promise of President John Tyler that in the case of rebellion, federal troops would be sent. There was a clause in the U.S. Constitution to meet just that kind of situation, providing for federal intervention to quell local insurrections on request of a state government. Ignoring this, on May 3, 1842, the Dorr forces held an inauguration with a great parade of artisans, shopkeepers, mechanics, and militia marching through Providence. The newly elected People's Legislature was convened. Dorr led a fiasco of an attack on the state arsenal, his cannon misfiring. Dorr's arrest was ordered by the regular governor, and he went into hiding outside the state, trying to raise military support. Despite the protests of Dorr and a few others, the People's Constitution kept the word white in its clause designating voters. Angry Rhode Island blacks now joined the militia units of the Law and Order Coalition, which promised that a new constitutional convention would give them the right to vote. When Dorr returned to Rhode Island, he found several hundred of his followers, mostly working people, willing to fight for the People's Constitution. But there were thousands in the regular militia on the side of the state. The rebellion disintegrated, and Dorr again fled Rhode Island. Martial law was declared. One rebel soldier, captured, was blindfolded and put before a firing squad, which fired with blank bullets. 100 other militia were taken prisoner. One of them described their being bound by ropes into platoons of 8, marched on foot 16 miles to Providence. Threatened and pricked by the bayonet if we lagged from fatigue, the rope severely chafing our arms, the skin off mine. No water till we reached Greenville, no food until the next day, and after being exhibited, were put into state prison. A new constitution offered some reform. It still gave overrepresentation to the rural areas, limited the vote to property owners or those who paid a $1 poll tax, and would let naturalized citizens vote only if they had $134 in real estate. In the elections of early 1843, the Law and Order group, opposed by former Dorites, used intimidation of state militia, of employees by employers, of tenants by landlords, to get out their vote. It lost in the industrial towns, but got the vote of the agrarian areas and won all major offices. Dorr returned to Rhode Island in the fall of 1843. He was arrested on the streets of Providence and tried for treason. The jury, instructed by the judge to ignore all political arguments and consider only whether Dorr had committed certain overt acts, which he never denied committing, found him guilty, whereupon the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment at hard labor. He spent 20 months in jail, and then a newly elected Law and Order governor, anxious to end Dorr's martyrdom, pardoned him. Armed force had failed. The ballot had failed. The courts had taken the side of the conservatives. The Dorr movement now went to the U.S. Supreme Court via a trespass suit by Martin Luther against Law and Order militiamen, charging that the People's Government was the legitimate government in Rhode Island in 1842. Daniel Webster argued against the Dorrites. If people could claim a constitutional right to overthrow an existing government, Webster said, there would be no more law and no more government. There would be anarchy. In its decision, the Supreme Court established Luther v. Borden, 1849, a long-lasting doctrine. It would not interfere in certain political questions to be left to executive and legislature. The decision reinforced the essentially conservative nature of the Supreme Court, that on critical issues, war and revolution, it would defer to the President and Congress. The stories of the anti-renter movement and Dorr's rebellion are not usually found in textbooks on United States history. In these books given to millions of young Americans, there is little on class struggle in the 19th century. The period before and after the Civil War is filled with politics, elections, slavery, and the race question. Even where specialized books on the Jacksonian period deal with labor and economic issues, they center on the presidency, and thus perpetuate the traditional dependency on heroic leaders rather than people's struggles. Andrew Jackson said he spoke for the humble members of society, the farmer, mechanics, and laborers. He certainly did not speak for the Indians being pushed off their lands or slaves. But the tensions aroused by the developing factory system, the growing immigration, required that the government develop a mass base of support among whites. Jacksonian democracy did just that. Politics in this period of the 1830s and 1840s, according to Douglas Miller, a specialist in the Jacksonian period, the birth of modern America, had become increasingly centered around creating a popular image and flattering the common man. Miller is dubious, however, about the accuracy of that phrase, Jacksonian democracy. Parades, picnics, and campaigns of personal slander characterized Jacksonian politicking. But although both parties aimed their rhetoric at the people and mouthed the sacred shibboleths of democracy, this did not mean that the common man ruled America. The professional politicians coming to the fore in the 20s and 30s, though sometimes self-made, were seldom ordinary. Both major parties were controlled largely by men of wealth and ambition. Lawyers, newspaper editors, merchants, industrialists, large landowners, and speculators dominated the Democrats as well as the Whigs. Jackson was the first president to master the liberal rhetoric, to speak for the common man. This was a necessity for political victory when the vote was being demanded, as in Rhode Island, by more and more people, and state legislatures were loosening voting restrictions. As another Jacksonian scholar, Robert Remini, The Age of Jackson, says, after studying electoral figures for 1828 and 1832, Jackson himself enjoyed widespread support that ranged across all classes and sections of the country. He attracted farmers, mechanics, laborers, professionals, and even businessmen. And all this without Jackson being clearly pro or anti-labor, pro or anti-business, pro or anti-lower, middle, or upper class. It has been demonstrated that he was a strikebreaker. Jackson sent troops to control rebellious workers on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. Yet, at different times, he and the Democrats received the backing of organized labor. It was the new politics of ambiguity, speaking for the lower and middle classes to get their support in times of rapid growth and potential turmoil. The two-party system came into its own in this time. To give people a choice between two different parties and allow them, in a period of rebellion, to choose the slightly more democratic one was an ingenious mode of control. Like so much in the American system, it was not devilishly contrived by some master plotters. It developed naturally out of the needs of the situation. Remini compares the Jacksonian Democrat Martin Van Buren, who succeeded Jackson as president, with the Austrian conservative statesman Metternich. Like Metternich, who was seeking to thwart revolutionary discontent in Europe, Van Buren and similar politicians were attempting to banish political disorder from the United States by a balance of power achieved through two well-organized and active parties. The Jacksonian idea was to achieve stability and control by winning to the Democratic Party the middling interest and especially the substantial yeomanry of the country by prudent, judicious, well-considered reform. That is, reform that would not yield too much. These were the words of Robert Rantoul, a reformer, corporation lawyer, and Jacksonian Democrat. It was a forecast of the successful appeal of the Democratic Party, and at times the Republican Party, in the 20th century. Such new forms of political control were needed in the turbulence of growth, the possibility of rebellion. Now there were canals, railroads, the telegraph. In 1790, fewer than 1 million Americans lived in cities. In 1840, the figure was 11 million. New York had 130,000 people in 1820, 1 million by 1860. And while the traveler Alexis de Tocqueville had expressed astonishment at the general equality of condition among the people, he was not very good at numbers, his friend Beaumont said, and his observation was not in accord with the facts, according to Edward Pessin, a historian of Jacksonian society, Jacksonian America. In Philadelphia, working-class families lived 55 to a tenement, usually one room per family, with no garbage removal, no toilets, no fresh air or water. There was fresh water newly pumped from the Schuylkill River, but it was going to the homes of the rich. In New York, you could see the poor lying in the streets with the garbage. There were no sewers in the slums, and filthy water drained into yards and alleys, into the cellars where the poorest of the poor lived, bringing with it a typhoid epidemic in 1837, typhus in 1842. In the cholera epidemic of 1832, the rich fled the city. The poor stayed and died. These poor could not be counted on as political allies of the government, but they were there, like slaves or Indians, invisible ordinarily, a menace if they rose. There were more solid citizens, however, who might give steady support to the system, better paid workers, land-owning farmers. Also, there was the new urban white-collar worker, born in the rising commerce of the time, described by Thomas Cochrane and William Miller, The Age of Enterprise. Dressed in drab alpaca, hunched over a high desk, this new worker credited and debited, indexed and filed, wrote and stamped invoices, acceptances, bills of lading, receipts. Adequately paid, he had some extra money and leisure time. He patronized sporting events and theaters, savings banks and insurance companies. He read Gay's New York Sun or Bennett's Herald, and penny press supported by advertising, filled with police reports, crime stories, etiquette advice for the rising bourgeoisie. This was the advance guard of a growing class of white-collar workers and professionals in America, who would be wooed enough and paid enough to consider themselves members of the bourgeois class and to give support to that class in times of crisis. The opening of the West was being helped by mechanization of the farm. Iron plows cut plowing time in half. By the 1850s, John Deere Company was turning out 10,000 plows a year. Cyrus McCormick was making 1,000 mechanical reapers a year in his factory in Chicago. A man with a sickle could cut half an acre of wheat in a day. With a reaper, he could cut 10 acres. Turnpikes, canals, and railroads were bringing more people west, more products east, and it became important to keep that new West tumultuous and unpredictable under control. When colleges were established out West, Eastern businessmen, as Cochrane and Miller say, were determined from the start to control Western education. Edward Everett, the Massachusetts politician and orator, spoke in 1833 on behalf of giving financial aid to Western colleges. Let no Boston capitalist, then let no man who has a large stake in New England, think that he is called upon to exercise his liberality at a distance toward those in whom he has no concern. They ask you to give security to your own property by diffusing the means of light and truth throughout the region, where so much of the power to preserve or to shake it resides. The capitalists of the East were conscious of the need for this security to your own property. As technology developed, more capital was needed, more risks had to be taken, and a big investment needed stability. In an economic system not rationally planned for human need, but developing fitfully, chaotically out of the profit motive, there seemed to be no way to avoid recurrent booms and slumps. There was a slump in 1837, another in 1853. One way to achieve stability was to decrease competition, organize the businesses, move toward monopoly. In the mid-1850s, price agreements and mergers became frequent. The New York Central Railroad was a merger of many railroads. The American Brass Association was formed to meet ruinous competition, it said. The Hampton County Cotton Spinners Association was organized to control prices, and so was the American Iron Association. Another way to minimize risks was to make sure the government played its traditional role, going back to Alexander Hamilton and the First Congress, of helping the business interests. State legislatures gave charters to corporations, giving them legal rights to conduct business, raise money. At first special charters, then general charters, so that any business meeting certain requirements could incorporate. Between 1790 and 1860, 2,300 corporations were chartered. Railroad men traveled to Washington and to state capitals armed with money, shares of stock, free railroad passes. Between 1850 and 1857, they got 25 million acres of public land, free of charge, and millions of dollars in bonds, loans from the state legislatures. In Wisconsin in 1856, the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad got 1 million acres free by distributing about $900,000 in stocks and bonds to 59 assemblymen, 13 senators, and the governor. 2 years later, the railroad was bankrupt and the bonds were worthless. In the East, mill owners had become powerful and organized. By 1850, 15 Boston families called the Associates controlled 20% of the cotton spindlage in the United States, 39% of insurance capital in Massachusetts, 40% of banking resources in Boston. In the school books, those years are filled with the controversy over slavery. But on the eve of the Civil War, it was money and profit, not the movement against slavery, that was uppermost in the priorities of the men who ran the country. As Cochrane and Miller put it, Webster was the hero of the North, not Emerson, Parker, Garrison, or Phillips. Webster, the tariff man, the land speculator, the corporation lawyer, politician for the Boston Associates, inheritor of Hamilton's coronet. The great object of government, said he, is the protection of property at home and respect and renown abroad. For these he preached union. For these he surrendered the fugitive slave. They described the Boston rich. Living sumptuously on Beacon Hill, admired by their neighbors for their philanthropy and their patronage of art and culture, these men traded in State Street, while overseers ran their factories, managers directed their railroads, agents sold their water power and real estate. They were absentee landlords in the most complete sense. Uncontaminated by the diseases of the factory town, they were also protected from hearing the complaints of their workers or suffering mental depression from dismal and squalid surroundings. In the metropolis, art, literature, education, science flowered in the golden day. In the industrial towns, children went to work with their fathers and mothers. Schools and doctors were only promises. A bed of one's own was a rare luxury. Ralph Waldo Emerson described Boston in those years. There is a certain poor smell in all the streets. In Beacon Street and Mount Vernon, as well as in the lawyers' offices and the wharves, and the same meanness and sterility and leave all hope behind as one finds in a boot manufacturer's premises. The preacher Theodore Parker told his congregation, "Money is this day the strongest power of the nation." The attempts at political stability and economic control did not quite work. The new industrialism, the crowded cities, the long hours in the factories, the sudden economic crises leading to high prices and loss of jobs, the lack of food and water, the freezing winters, the hot tenements in the summer, the epidemics of disease, the deaths of children. These led to sporadic reactions from the poor. Sometimes there were spontaneous, unorganized uprisings against the rich. Sometimes the anger was deflected into racial hatred for blacks, religious warfare against Catholics, nativist fury against immigrants. Sometimes it was organized into demonstrations and strikes. Jacksonian democracy had tried to create a consensus of support for the system to make it secure. Blacks, Indians, women, and foreigners were clearly outside the consensus, but also white working people in large numbers declared themselves outside. The full extent of the working class consciousness of those years, as of any years, is lost in history. But fragments remain and make us wonder how much of this always existed underneath the very practical silence of working people. In 1827, an address before the mechanics and working classes of Philadelphia was recorded, written by an unlettered mechanic, probably a young shoemaker, who said, "We find ourselves oppressed on every hand. We labor hard in producing all the comforts of life for the enjoyment of others, while we ourselves obtain but a scanty portion, and even that, in the present state of society, depends on the will of employers." Francis Wright of Scotland, an early feminist and utopian socialist, was invited by Philadelphia workingmen to speak on the 4th of July, 1829. It's one of the first citywide associations of labor unions in the United States. She asked if the revolution had been fought to crush down the sons and daughters of your country's industry under neglect, poverty, vice, starvation, and disease. She wondered if the new technology was not lowering the value of human labor, making people appendages to machines, crippling the minds and bodies of child laborers. Later that year, George Henry Evans, a printer, editor of the Working Man's Advocate, wrote, "The Working Men's Declaration of Independence. Among its list of facts submitted to candid and impartial fellow citizens. 1. The laws for levying taxes are operating almost oppressively on one class of society. 3. The laws for private incorporation are all partial, favoring one class of society to the expense of the other. 6. The laws have deprived 9/10 of the members of the body politic, who are not wealthy, of the equal means to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The lien law in favor of the landlords against tenants is one illustration among innumerable others." Evans believed that all on arriving at adult age are entitled to equal property. A citywide trades union in Boston in 1834, including mechanics from Charlestown and women shoe binders from Lynn, referred to the Declaration of Independence. "We hold that laws which have a tendency to raise any peculiar class above their fellow citizens by granting special privileges are contrary to and in defiance of those primary principles. Our public system of education, which so liberally endows those seminaries of learning, are only accessible to the wealthy, while our common schools are so ill provided for. Thus, even in childhood, the poor are apt to think themselves inferior." In his book, Most Uncommon Jacksonians, Edward Pessin says, "The leaders of the Jacksonian labor movement were radicals. How else describe men who believed American society to be torn with social conflict, disfigured by the misery of the masses, and dominated by a greedy elite whose power over every aspect of American life was based on private property?" Episodes of insurrection of that time have gone unrecorded in traditional histories. Such was the riot in Baltimore in the summer of 1835, when the Bank of Maryland collapsed and its depositors lost their savings. Convinced that a great fraud had taken place, a crowd gathered and began breaking the windows of officials associated with the bank. When the rioters destroyed a house, the militia attacked, killing some 20 people, wounding 100. The next evening, other houses were attacked. The events were reported in Niles' Weekly Register, an important newspaper of that time. Last night, Sunday, at dark, the attack was renewed upon Reverend E. Johnson's house. There was now no opposition. It was supposed that several thousand people were spectators of the scene. The house was soon entered, and its furniture, a very extensive law library, and all its contents were cast forth, a bonfire made of them in front of the house. The whole interior of the house was torn out and cast upon the burning pile. The marble portico in front and a great portion of the front wall were torn down by about 11 o'clock. They proceeded to that of the mayor of the city, Jesse Hunt, Esquire, broke it open, took out the furniture, and burnt it before the door. During those years, trade unions were forming. Philip Foner's History of the Labor Movement in the U.S. tells the story in rich detail. The courts call them conspiracies to restrain trade and therefore illegal, as when in New York, 25 members of the Union Society of Journeymen Tailors were found guilty of conspiracy to injure trade, riot, assault, battery. The judge, levying fines, said, "In this favored land of law and liberty, the road to advancement is open to all. Every American knows that, or ought to know that he has no better friend than the laws, and that he needs no artificial combination for his protection. They are of foreign origin, and I am led to believe mainly upheld by foreigners." A handbill was then circulated throughout the city. "The rich against the poor. Judge Edwards, the tool of the aristocracy against the people. Mechanics and working men. A deadly blow has been struck at your liberty. They have established the precedent that working men have no right to regulate the price of labor, or, in other words, the rich are the only judges of the wants of the poor man." At City Hall Park, 27,000 people gathered to denounce the court decision and elected a committee of correspondence, which organized 3 months later a convention of mechanics, farmers, and working men, elected by farmers and working people in various towns in New York State. The convention met in Utica, drew up a Declaration of Independence from existing political parties, and established an Equal Rights Party. Although they ran their own candidates for office, there was no great confidence in the ballot as a way of achieving change. One of the great orators of the movement, Seth Luther, told a 4th of July rally, "We will try the ballot box first. If that will not affect our righteous purpose, the next and last resort is the cartridge box." And one sympathetic local newspaper, the Albany Microscope, warned, "Remember the regretted fate of the working men. They were soon destroyed by hitching teams and rolling with parties. They admitted into their ranks broken down lawyers and politicians. They became perverted and were unconsciously drawn into a vortex from which they never escaped." The crisis of 1837 led to rallies and meetings in many cities. The banks had suspended specie payments, refusing to pay hard money for the banknotes they had issued. Prices rose, and working people, already hard-pressed to buy food, found that flour that had sold at $5.62 a barrel was now $12 a barrel. Pork went up. Coal went up. In Philadelphia, 20,000 people assembled, and someone wrote to President Van Buren describing it. "This afternoon, the largest public meeting I ever saw assembled in Independence Square. It was called by placards posted throughout the city yesterday and last night. It was projected and carried on entirely by the working classes, without consultation or cooperation with any of those who usually take the lead in such matters. The officers and speakers were of those classes. It was directed against the banks." In New York, members of the Equal Rights Party, often called the Locofocos, announced a meeting. "Bread, meat, rent, and fuel. Their prices must come down. The people will meet in the park, rain or shine, at 4 o'clock p.m. on Monday afternoon. All friends of humanity determined to resist monopolists and extortioners are invited to attend." The Commercial Register, a New York newspaper, reported on the meeting and what followed. At 4 o'clock, a concourse of several thousands had convened in front of the City Hall. One of these orators is reported to have expressly directed the popular vengeance against Mr. Eli Hart, who was one of our most extensive flour dealers on commission. "Fellow citizens," he exclaimed, Mr. Hart has now 53,000 barrels of flour in his store. Let us go and offer him $8 a barrel, and if he does not take it..." A large body of the meeting moved off in the direction of Mr. Hart's store. The middle door had been forced, and some 20 or 30 barrels of flour or more rolled into the streets, and the heads staved in. At this point of time, Mr. Hart himself arrived on the ground with a posse of officers from the police. The officers were assailed by a portion of the mob in Day Street. Their staves wrested from them and shivered to pieces. Barrels of flour by dozens, 50s, and hundreds were tumbled into the street from the doors and thrown in rapid succession from the windows. About 1,000 bushels of wheat and 400 or 500 barrels of flour were thus wantonly and foolishly, as well as wickedly, destroyed. The most active of the destructionists were foreigners. Indeed, the greater part of the assemblage was of exotic origin, but there were probably 500 or 1,000 others standing by and abetting their incendiary labors. Amidst the falling and bursting of the barrels and sacks of wheat, numbers of women were engaged, like the crones who stripped the dead in battle, filling the boxes and baskets with which they were provided, and their aprons with flour, and making off with it. Night had now closed upon the scene, but the work of destruction did not cease until strong bodies of police arrived, followed soon afterward by detachments of troops. This was the Flour Riot of 1837. During the crisis of that year, 50,000 persons, 1/3 of the working class, were without work in New York City alone, and 200,000 of a population of 500,000 were living, as one observer put it, in utter and hopeless distress. There is no complete record of the meetings, riots, actions, organized and disorganized, violent and nonviolent, which took place in the mid-19th century as the country grew, as the cities became crowded, with working conditions bad, living conditions intolerable, with the economy in the hands of bankers, speculators, landlords, merchants. In 1835, 50 different trades organized unions in Philadelphia, and there was a successful general strike of laborers, factory workers, bookbinders, jewelers, coal heavers, butchers, cabinet workers for the 10-hour day. Soon, there were 10-hour laws in Pennsylvania and other states, but they provided that employers could have employees sign contracts for longer hours. The law at this time was developing a strong defense of contracts. It was pretended that work contracts were voluntary agreements between equals. Weavers in Philadelphia in the early 1840s, mostly Irish immigrants working at home for employers, struck for higher wages, attacked the homes of those refusing to strike, and destroyed their work. A sheriff's posse tried to arrest some strikers, but it was broken up by 400 weavers armed with muskets and sticks. Soon, however, antagonism developed between these Irish Catholic weavers and native-born Protestant skilled workers over issues of religion. In May 1844, there were Protestant Catholic riots in Kensington, a suburb of Philadelphia. Nativist, anti-immigrant rioters destroyed the weavers' neighborhoods and attacked the Catholic Church. Middle-class politicians soon led each group into a different political party, the nativists into the American Republican Party, the Irish into the Democratic Party. Party politics and religion now substituting for class conflict. The result of all this, says David Montgomery, historian of the Kensington riots, was the fragmentation of the Philadelphia working class. It thereby created for historians the illusion of a society lacking in class conflict, while in reality the class conflicts of 19th century America were as fierce as any known to the industrial world. The immigrants from Ireland, fleeing starvation there when the potato crop failed, were coming to America now, packed into old sailing ships. The stories of these ships differ only in detail from the accounts of the ships that earlier brought black slaves and later German, Italian, Russian immigrants. This is a contemporary account of one ship arriving from Ireland, detained at Grosse Island on the Canadian border. On the 18th of May, 1847, the Urania from Cork, with several hundred immigrants on board, a large proportion of them sick and dying of the ship fever, was put into quarantine at Grosse Island. This was the first of the plague-smitten ships from Ireland which that year sailed up the St. Lawrence. But before the first week of June, as many as 84 ships of various tonnage were driven in by an easterly wind, And of that enormous number of vessels, there was not one free from the taint of malignant typhus, the offspring of famine, and of the foul ship-hold. A tolerably quick passage occupied from 6 to 8 weeks. Who can imagine the horrors of even the shortest passage in an immigrant ship crowded beyond its utmost capacity of stowage, with unhappy beings of all ages, with fever raging in their midst, the crew sullen or brutal from very desperation, or paralyzed with terror of the plague, the miserable passengers unable to help themselves or afford the least relief to each other, 1/4 or 1/3 or 1/2 of the entire number in different stages of the disease, many dying, some dead. The fatal poison intensified by the indescribable foulness of the air breathed and rebreathed by the gasping sufferers, the wails of children, the ravings of the delirious, the cries and groans of those in mortal agony. There was no accommodation of any kind on the island. Sheds were rapidly filled with the miserable people. Hundreds were literally flung on the beach, left amid the mud and stones to crawl on the dry land how they could. Many of these gasped out their last breath on that fatal shore, not able to drag themselves from the slime in which they lay. It was not until the 1st of November that the quarantine of Grosse Isle was closed. Upon that barren isle, as many as 10,000 of the Irish race were consigned to the grave pit. How could these new Irish immigrants, themselves poor and despised, become sympathizers with the black slave, who was becoming more and more the center of attention, the subject of agitation in the country? Indeed, most working-class activists at this time ignored the plight of blacks. Eli Moore, a New York trade union leader elected to Congress, argued in the House of Representatives against receiving abolitionist petitions. Racist hostility became an easy substitute for class frustration. On the other hand, a white shoemaker wrote in 1848 in The Awl, the newspaper of Lynn shoe factory workers, "We are nothing but a standing army that keeps 3 million of our brethren in bondage, living under the shade of Bunker Hill Monument, demanding in the name of humanity our right, and withholding those rights from others because their skin is black. Is it any wonder that God in his righteous anger has punished us by forcing us to drink the bitter cup of degradation?" The anger of the city poor often expressed itself in futile violence over nationality or religion. In New York in 1849, a mob, largely Irish, stormed the fashionable Astor Place Opera House, where an English actor, William Charles Macready, was playing Macbeth, in competition with an American actor, Edwin Forrest, who was acting the same role in another production. The crowd shouting, "Burn the damned den of aristocracy," charged, throwing bricks. The militia were called out, and in the violence that followed, about 200 people were killed or wounded. Another economic crisis came in 1857. The boom in railroads and manufacturing, the surge of immigration, the increased speculation in stocks and bonds, the stealing, corruption, manipulation, led to wild expansion and then crash. By October of that year, 200,000 were unemployed, and thousands of recent immigrants crowded into the eastern ports, hoping to work their way back to Europe. The New York Times reported, "Every ship for Liverpool now has all the passengers she can carry, and multitudes are applying to work their passage if they have no money to pay for it." In Newark, New Jersey, a rally of several thousand demanded the city give work to the unemployed. And in New York, 15,000 people met at Tompkins Square in downtown Manhattan. From there, they marched to Wall Street and paraded around the stock exchange shouting, "We want work." That summer, riots occurred in the slum areas of New York. A mob of 500 attacked the police one day with pistols and bricks. There were parades of the unemployed demanding bread and work, looting shops. In November, a crowd occupied City Hall, and the U.S. Marines were brought in to drive them out. Of the country's workforce of 6 million in 1850, 500,000 were women. 330,000 worked as domestics. 55,000 were teachers. Of the 181,000 women in factories, half worked in textile mills. They organized. Women struck by themselves for the first time in 1825. They were the United Tailoresses of New York, demanding higher wages. In 1828, the first strike of mill women on their own took place in Dover, New Hampshire, when several hundred women paraded with banners and flags against new factory rules, which charged fines for coming late, forbade talking on the job, and required church attendance. They were forced to return to the mill, their demands unmet, and their leaders were fired and blacklisted. In Exeter, New Hampshire, women mill workers went on strike, turned out in the language of that day, because the overseer was setting the clocks back to get more time from them. Their strike succeeded in exacting a promise from the company that the overseers would set their watches right. The Lowell system, in which young girls would go to work in the mills and live in dormitories supervised by matrons, at first seemed beneficent, sociable, a welcome escape from household drudgery or domestic service. Lowell, Massachusetts, was the first town created for the textile mill industry. It was named after the wealthy and influential Lowell family. But the dormitories became prison-like, controlled by rules and regulations. The supper, served after the women had risen at 4 in the morning and worked until 7:30 in the evening, often consisted merely of bread and gravy. So the Lowell girls organized. They started their own newspapers. They protested against the weaving rooms, which were poorly lit, badly ventilated, impossibly hot in the summer, damp and cold in the winter. In 1834, a cut in wages led the Lowell women to strike, proclaiming, "Union is power. Our present object is to have union and exertion, and we remain in possession of our own unquestionable rights." But the threat of hiring others to replace them brought them back to work at reduced wages. The leaders were fired. The young women, determined to do better next time, organized a Factory Girls Association, and 1,500 went on strike in 1836 against a raise in boarding house charges. Harriet Hanson was an 11-year-old girl working in the mill. She later recalled, "I worked in a lower room where I had heard the proposed strike fully, if not vehemently, discussed. I had been an ardent listener to what was said against this attempt at oppression on the part of the corporation, and naturally I took sides with the strikers. When the day came on which the girls were to turn out, those in the upper room started first, and so many of them left that our mill was at once shut down. Then when the girls in my room stood irresolute, uncertain what to do, I, who began to think they would not go out after all their talk, became impatient and started on ahead, saying with childish bravado, 'I don't care what you do, I am going to turn out, whether anyone else does or not.' And I marched out and was followed by the others. As I look back at the long line that followed me, I was more proud than I have ever been since." The strikers marched through the streets of Lowell singing. They held out a month, but then their money ran out. They were evicted from the boarding houses, and many of them went back to work. The leaders were fired, including Harriet Hanson's widowed mother, a matron in the boarding house, who was blamed for her child's going out on strike. Resistance continued. One mill in Lowell, Herbert Gutman reports, discharged 28 women for such reasons as misconduct, disobedience, impudence, levity, and mutiny. Meanwhile, the girls tried to hold on to thoughts about fresh air, the country, a less harried way of life. One of them recalled, "I never cared much for machinery. I could not see into their complications or feel interested in them. In sweet June weather, I would lean far out of the window and try not to hear the unceasing clash of sound inside." In New Hampshire, 500 men and women petitioned the Amaskiag Manufacturing Company not to cut down an elm tree to make space for another mill. They said it was a beautiful and goodly tree, representing a time when the yell of the red man and the scream of the eagle were alone heard on the banks of the Merrimack, instead of two giant edifices filled with the buzz of busy and well-remunerated industry. In 1835, 20 mills went on strike to reduce the workday from 13.5 hours to 11 hours, to get cash wages instead of company scrip, and to end fines for lateness. 1,500 children and parents went out on strike, and it lasted 6 weeks. Strikebreakers were brought in, and some workers went back to work. But the strikers did win a 12-hour day and 9 hours on Saturday. That year and the next, there were 140 strikes in the eastern part of the United States. The crisis that followed the 1837 panic stimulated the formation in 1845 of the Female Labor Reform Association in Lowell. which sent thousands of petitions to the Massachusetts legislature asking for a 10-hour day. Finally, the legislature decided to hold public hearings, the first investigation of labor conditions by any governmental body in the country. Eliza Hemingway told the committee of the air thick with smoke from oil lamps burning before sunup and after sundown. Judith Payne told of her sickness due to the work in the mills. But after the committee visited the mills, for which the company prepared by a cleanup job, it reported, "Your committee returned fully satisfied that the order, decorum, and general appearance of things in and around the mills could not be improved by any suggestion of theirs or by any act of the legislature." The report was denounced by the Female Labor Reform Association, and they worked successfully for the committee chairman's defeat at the next election, though they could not vote. But not much was done to change conditions in the mills. In the late 1840s, the New England farm women who worked in the mills began to leave them, as more and more Irish immigrants took their place. Company towns now grew up around mills in Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, using immigrant workers who signed contracts pledging everyone in the family to work for a year. They lived in slum tenements owned by the company, were paid in scrip, which they could use only at company stores, and were evicted if their work was unsatisfactory. In Paterson, New Jersey, the first of a series of mill strikes was started by children. When the company suddenly put off their dinner hour from noon to 1 p.m., the children marched off the job, their parents cheering them on. They were joined by other working people in the town, carpenters, masons, machinists, who turned the strike into a 10-hour day struggle. After a week, however, with the factories, replacing shoemaker